Welcome to Game Plunge, a series all about the analysis and discussion of game design. With the success of the first Half-Life, there was a lot of pressure on Valve to make a worthy successor. They took their time to carefully craft a sequel. With Half-Life 1 released in 1998, fans had to wait for a very long time for a new Half-Life game. They took so long, in fact, that Valve became synonymous with postponing deadlines and delaying their releases with the term Valve time. But Valve showed that taking your time really can lead to great things, with the release of the eagerly awaited Half-Life 2 in 2004. Fans wondered if it could live up to the huge hype surrounding the game, but Half-Life 2 went above and beyond, and once again, Valve managed to push the first-person shooter genre to new levels. The game was met with great praise from critics and fans. But what made Half-Life 2 so special? Aside from the technical advancements, what was it about the game and its design that made it so likable? First of all, Half-Life 2 has a phenomenal start. It isn't spectacular with huge set pieces and cutscenes, but that's what makes it so good. The game starts out with you riding on a train cart. At this point, you're not a hero, nobody really knows you, and you're pretty much just like everybody else, an average citizen. All around you see this dystopian future world, which feels strange to you, but all the people surrounding you seem to find it completely normal. Even though you know nothing about the world and story yet, the game shows you immediately and very clearly what is going on. You see people being oppressed, all kinds of strange futuristic technology, and most importantly, one gigantic screen used for propaganda. This single first area probably tells you more than any cutscene possibly could. The game lets you experience the world. It makes you feel like you are a part of the things that are going on, rather than simply a spectator. This environmental storytelling is an incredibly powerful tool, and the designers of Half-Life show you exactly why. Because even though you knew nothing about the world before, in a few minutes you can find out a lot about everything that's happened. Not only can you listen to the propaganda on the screen for some background information, the citizens around you also tell you a lot about what exactly is going on.
I wouldn't say that too loud. This is his base of operations.
But there is a trade-off between the amount of freedom the player is given and the narrative of the game. Half-Life 2 gives the player a lot of freedom to explore and mess about, but this also means that they can just completely ignore the game's events. This can result in a conflict between gameplay and narrative. The player can go against the designer's intentions, which we call subversive play. Keep in mind that subversive play isn't only bound to narrative, but in this case it gives us a clear example of what the term means. The entire first part of the game you have no weapons, you have absolutely no way of fighting the oppression you see around you. All of this makes you feel powerless. This disempowerment works tremendously well for immersing you into the game, which is exactly what you need in the first few minutes to draw players in. A good example of this disempowerment is the part where you are forced to throw away a can one of the Combine throws on the ground. You want to resist, but the guard won't let you through unless you throw away the can. The guard threatens you with his stun stick and you feel forced to obey his command. This part leaves a huge impression on the player. It makes you want to fight these guys, it makes you feel justified pushing back this oppression, and it shows you exactly why you should defeat those Combine. These feelings are catered to even more in the scenes you encounter further on. This first part doesn't only provide you with some context and background for the story. They also put in a few parts where they teach you some of the mechanics of the game. For instance, you need to know how to pick up and move objects, since that is an important skill in the game. Pretty much every object has physics and can be used to your advantage. So right after you met up with Barney, he urged you to rush out and stack up some boxes to jump out of the windows. The game makes this exciting by creating a false sense of urgency. It plays some sounds of soldiers knocking on the door and it makes you feel like they could rush in at any time. But in reality, you have all the time you need. This makes an otherwise mundane task of learning how to stack up boxes exciting and tense. Since you don't have any weapons yet, this false sense of urgency works very well for keeping the game exciting without any actual combat. They use this same technique a second time a bit further ahead, where a civilian supposedly holds back the guards for you. This tension is used to make the player scared of the Combine and to make them feel like a more formidable and stronger enemy early on. Later on, they teach you a few more basic things in Kleiner's lab. First of all, you have some time to freely mess about with the physics. You can throw objects around and get a feel for how the physics behave in the game. This is also the point in the game where you are given some new abilities by getting the HEV suit. They show you the new HEV suit chargers, so that you know what they look like and how to use them. Just to make sure you understand how to interact with objects, you have to throw the switch for the portal. Then you have to plug in the plug that was blown out. It is important the player has this knowledge now, because it will be used many more times throughout the game. This is the point where the tutorial of the game ends and the actual game really starts. Just to make sure you mastered sprinting, jumping and interacting with objects, you have to go through a small crash course where your mastery of the controls is really put to the test. You need to dodge trains, jump into carts, open doors, break crates blocking your path. Everything you learned so far is repeated to make sure you know what you're doing. Shortly after that, you get to kill your first Combine soldiers. But Half-Life doesn't let you kill those soldiers without giving you some kind of justification for your actions. You do not simply encounter two seemingly innocent soldiers on patrol. No, instead you see them beat down a citizen. Once again, you are reminded how evil those soldiers are. But this is the first time you actually get to do something about it. You now receive your first gun from one of the soldiers, and you immediately get to use it. Aside from giving you a gun, this level also introduces the explosive barrels for the first time. Now pay attention to how these barrels are placed. It may not look that special now, but just a bit later you will see why these barrels were here. Once you get across the railway tracks, you have to shoot a couple of soldiers from the other side of the tracks. And now you can see why those barrels were there. Because by shooting at these soldiers, chances are you will also hit these red barrels at some point. If you have played a lot of games, however, you are probably familiar with the color coding. Red barrels mean explosive barrels. And of course, if you do hit the barrels and make them explode, the enemies are close enough to be killed by the explosion. But the designers wanted to make sure you know what those barrels are for. So just in case you missed them before, they block your path with a couple of barrels. And now you have no choice but to shoot the barrels and make them explode to clear a path. At this point in the game, you have probably lost some health, or you need some ammunition. So the game throws a new mechanic at you: supply crates. Because these are a vital part of the game, you must learn to recognize these crates before going on. That is why you are forced to crawl through this shaft. You will quickly notice that your path is blocked by such a crate. There is really only one thing you can do to progress, and that is to break it with your crowbar. You then notice some things falling out of this crate, indicating that these crates will give you some supplies. So by now you've learned a few things. 1. Use your gun to kill enemies. 2. Red barrels explode. And 3. Yellow crates give you supplies. Once again, the designers have to make sure you understand these things before introducing new mechanics. That is why the rest of this section serves to familiarize yourself with these 3 new mechanics. The entire hallway is filled with enemies, barrels and supply crates, so that you will know how these mechanics work before moving on. But having just very long sections of shooting and dodging would become boring after a while. This is why it is important to have good pacing. A common example of good pacing is this graph from Star Wars. It shows the levels of intensity over time, and this tension curve applies to pretty much all entertainment, including video games. As you can see, it is good practice to have alternating peaks and valleys of intensity. You basically want a powerful start to draw your audience in. Then things will settle down a bit, before slowly building up towards a final climax. You need to have these peaks and valleys to keep things interesting. And the designers of Half-Life understood this very well. Just constantly having shooting sections and action sequences make them less engaging over time. In other words, you need to have quiet moments to keep the tense moments interesting. A lot of times Half-Life chose to implement these quieter moments as a part of the story, where you can walk around and listen to the characters talk to each other. But Half-Life also likes to use puzzles to switch up the action a bit. Their physics mechanics give way for creating such puzzles and presenting a different kind of challenge to the player. However, these puzzles don't really feel like puzzles at all. They are often either too obvious or simply require you to look around for the right objects to use. Usually, there isn't an awful lot of thinking or problem solving involved in these physics puzzles. While it is a nice way to demonstrate the capabilities of their physics engine, the puzzles themselves are hardly ever truly challenging or even fun to do. The developers of Half-Life 2 were obviously very proud of their physics engine. So much so that they made their physics engine an integral part of the game. They created a weapon specifically designed to show off the true capabilities of their physics engine, the gravity gun. They valued the weapon so much that they even designed an entire level for its introduction. The first time you receive the gravity gun, you are slowly introduced to its functions. You get a safe environment to learn the basic controls used for the weapon. There is really nothing to harm you, and by giving you a few simple assignments, the designers want to make sure you understand the basic use of the weapon. But quickly after you're taught how the gravity gun works, things suddenly get kicked into 5th gear, and you are led to an abandoned village, Ravenholm. This entire stage is designed to train the player in the use of the gravity gun. This tutorial starts with the very first room you walk in. You can see that it is absolutely filled with saws and hooks and all kinds of deadly objects you can throw with the gravity gun. Right in front of you, the designers show you what damage you can do using these weapons around you. Finally, just to make sure you know that you can pick up these saw blades, they block your path with them. They pretty much force you to pick up these saw blades with your gravity gun before progressing. Then, the moment you pick up the saw blade, a zombie walks in. Your impulse is to quickly fire off that thing in your hands, which shows you exactly how powerful this weapon is. Another thing about Ravenholm is that there isn't a lot of ammunition to go around. This lack of ammunition has two purposes, both of which fit Ravenholm perfectly. The first is obviously that without any ammo for your guns, you need to rely more on your gravity gun, which is pretty much what Ravenholm was designed for. It forces you to look around for objects to throw, and you need to be constantly aware of your surroundings to find enough ammunition for your gravity gun. Which brings us to the second purpose. Because this lack of ammunition gives you a sense of disempowerment. By taking away most of your weapons, you feel weaker and more vulnerable. This makes the entire section a much scarier experience. Since Ravenholm is infested with zombies and headcrabs, it makes sense for the designers to introduce a few new enemies here. Which brings us to Half-Life 2's favorite way to scare us: poison headcrabs. These critters serve as an ideal way to scare the player without it being very unfair. When they attack you, you don't die or even take any real damage. They momentarily bring your health back to 1, which regenerates after a while. This means they can be used to simply scare the player without any serious consequences. And your first encounter with those headcrabs does exactly that. In this situation, you need to flick a switch on the wall over there. The first time you get here, nothing fishy seems to be going on. But once you flick the switch, you are jumped by these two poisonous headcrabs, which you didn't even see coming. This part was designed specifically to make sure you are bitten by these headcrabs, both to show you exactly what they do, as well as to scare you. They were purposely hidden by some furniture in the room, so you wouldn't notice them. But these poisonous headcrabs can be very dangerous when surrounded by different enemies. Even though your health will regenerate after you've been bit by them, if another enemy hits you before that, you're pretty much done. This is why every time you're hit by one of those headcrabs, you panic for a little while, since you're very vulnerable for that short amount of time. All of this contributed to make you feel weak and powerless in Ravenholm. But at the very end of Ravenholm, there is a clear contrast. Where everything was designed to take away your feeling of power, this very last section was designed completely opposite. In this final hallway, you get to activate a cart with a spinning saw blade on top, which slices all the zombies before you in half. The feeling of power you get is that much stronger, since you have been struggling with battling these zombies throughout all of Ravenholm. All the power you lost before is immediately returned with this section. It serves as a great transition between the weak and scared feeling in Ravenholm towards the strong and heroic theme in the rest of the game. This transition is accentuated even more by the shining bright light at the end of the tunnel. You walk into a completely different part of the game. As we've just seen, Half-Life doesn't really have any concrete written tutorials to teach you about its weapons. Rather, they present you with situations which encourage you to use weapons in a certain way, like how you need to use grenades to take out these snipers. The game doesn't explicitly tell you what to do, but it looks like there is something you can do about these snipers. The game hints at you by giving you some grenades, and it sets you up so that you could easily throw a grenade in there. Once you see it works, you will most likely remember it better than when they had just told you, since you pretty much found it out yourself. Another great example is when you first get the crossbow. In this section you were driving around in a car when suddenly your path is blocked with a bunch of vehicles. This forces you to get out and clear the way, but you'll probably also be drawn to this spot to explore. Here you will find a dead body with a crossbow next to it. When you've picked it up, you see a small town in front of you, and you are provided with the exact circumstances the crossbow is used for. Without explicitly telling you, you start using the crossbow exactly the way the designers intended, as a long-range sniping weapon. Another thing about this crossbow is that it utilizes the physics engine as well. Instead of simply killing the enemies, you can actually pin them to walls, which makes the weapon feel much more powerful. Finally, I'd like to talk about the final section of Half-Life, the Citadel. Throughout the entire game you could see this structure. The designers did everything they could to make the structure feel as giant and intimidating as possible. The first time you get really close to it, there are tremors just from standing close to the structure. On top of that, you get a feel for how gigantic this structure truly is. When you look down you can see the tower reaches all the way down, and when you look up, you can see the tower stretches as far as the eye can see. But this is just the outside of the tower. Entering the tower makes you feel even smaller than before. All around you see the entire structure move. There are all kinds of things going on around you. To accentuate even more just how tiny you are compared to the Citadel, you are forced to enter one of these pods. This takes you on a tour through the Citadel to make you experience the true size of it all. This part is pretty much the final valley of tension before the big finale. Then, the moment you are dropped from the pod, the tension rises immediately. All your weapons are destroyed except for your gravity gun, which gets a major boost and becomes incredibly powerful. It makes you feel pretty much unstoppable. The enemies you had so much difficulty fighting before are now your toys to throw around. You feel incredibly powerful, and it is the perfect example of the sensation aesthetic. This is all one huge build-up towards the final boss of the game. You get to blast through waves of enemies effortlessly, while Dr. Breen desperately tries to convince you to stop. The tension builds up and you feel completely ready to take down the Combine for good. But then, just as you felt ready to fight, you have to ride another pod. They make you wait just a bit longer before you get to fight the final battle. You watch the final parts of the story wrap up, and then finally you're in control again. You can finally fight the final boss to put an end to the Combine. You use your new gravity gun to blast through hordes of Combine and destroy the core of the Citadel. And just when you win, and the tension level is at its highest, the game stops. Half-Life 2 ends on the exact peak of tension, the same way a lot of TV shows do it. This way of ending on a peak of tension has a name you probably know very well. A cliffhanger. It is a classic way to set up a series for a sequel, but it comes at a price. It makes the experience itself not feel complete, because you lack closure. And this is what frustrates fans the most about the Half-Life 2 series right now. 2 sequel episodes came out, but even though they progressed the story of Half-Life, they did not bring closure. It makes the series feel incomplete, and it has felt this way for over 10 years now. And unfortunately, it doesn't look like the series will have closure anytime soon. But even though the Half-Life series hasn't been completed, there is still a lot we can learn from it. In many ways, Half-Life revolutionized gaming, and it is still an example of great game design.